Uh, so today I've put together a talk for you and to be able to talk about, downsizing or to talk about simplifying our gardens is something that's kind of been very prominent and new for me as well. As the director of the Kruckeberg Botanic Garden, I have 4 acres of garden there that I'm already tending. And I have a half-acre garden of my own here in Kenmore. And it's starting to become, insurmountable to keep up with my own work when I spend so much of my time at the Kruckeberg Botanic Garden. So today I'm going to go ahead and share my screen with you. I've got a presentation. Everybody see that okay?
Mm-hmm.
Great. So she mentioned shifting gears horticulturally, simplifying and downsizing, but to keep it pretty. That's an important part for any of us who are gardeners. We need some beauty in our lives. That's the whole point why we garden. We believe in beautification. But as we do get older or as we get busier, our lives require us to prioritize things. And a lot of times, I don't know about you, but oftentimes in life, and this last year and year are really good examples where some people found themselves at home and had an inordinate amount of time to be able to devote to their own gardens. We've seen that through visitation at the garden and also through plant sales. There's really been an upsurge in people buying plants. For me personally, my life took on a lot more complexity during those times, with family needs and family losses. And my garden had to take a back seat. So there was a lot of decline or a lot of just kind of overwhelm happening in the garden that would normally get my attention on a regular basis. So my point today is to talk about ways in which we can harness our gardens in a way that we don't diminish them completely, but make sure that they still fulfill a need within ourselves to be creative or to have that beauty or to have that sustainability of pollinators and ecological soundness within our homes and within our properties, but without having to slave over it, if you will, or have to get out there on our hands and knees all the time and try to keep up with it. So today's discussion, we're going to talk about what are the ways in which we can downsize our garden. We're going to talk about who's going to leave the garden, who's going to stay, and then we're going to talk about some key characters, if you will, to keep beauty in our garden, but without having to keep on top of it all the time, where they take care of themselves, if you will. So downsizing, we're going to use my garden as a case study today. This is a picture of my front garden from about a year ago. Believe it or not, there's a gravel path that goes through the middle of that. It's just been completely swallowed. This garden is from about 2014, and it is just layered, if you will, with bulbs and perennials, evergreen shrubs, deciduous plants, every kind of flowering perennial, because that's what I did. I would just walk through a nursery or something and I'd be like, I have to have that and I have to find a place to put it, and I would just squish it in there. And after several years, it has now basically swallowed my whole front yard. And one of the things about this garden is that it's such high maintenance. It's also a very high water user. There's such a density of plant material here that keeping up with the watering has become almost insurmountable. And this area is just, I would say, 1/3 of my garden. This is the rest of my garden. So I still have all of this to take care of as well, right? So I'm really struggling with this notion of having this front garden with this high level of maintenance and upkeep, but then also having this backyard. And I would point out, as you get towards the back of this garden here, where the red chairs are, behind that is another 80 feet of just green belt. So I have a huge piece of property that really requires a lot of attention. I've been very thoughtful. I've done what a lot of people will do, and I've basically cordoned off sections of my garden. So my front garden, as you saw, very high maintenance, lots and lots of material, lots and lots of layers. My backyard is a little more utilitarian because I do have 2 large dogs and I need them to be able to have space as well, but without overwhelming the space. So I have a lot of shrubs in my backyard, a lot of layers there, but I have a fairly large edible garden as well. So compartmentalizing is one of the strategies that I've used to help keep myself on track. I can work in one section and focus on the other each week and give myself time. But the reality is it's still a lot of work, and it's a lot of upkeep. So simplification. I spent a lot of time working on this and trying to come up with a solution for myself with how to deal with this space. And I stand in my big picture window of my house and look out at this all the time and try to think of what I can do. And so last year I made the decision that it was time for this whole front garden to undergo a renovation. It was time for it to transform into a space that I could come home to every day and not walk past and think, oh, I got to get out there, got to get out there, got to get this done. And so we came up with this. This is not my yard. It's really hard to do this on Zoom because I can't hear you laughing. I know you're laughing, right? You're laughing. You're laughing at the absurdity of this. But what this is of course, is the extreme notion of simplification within our homes and our horticulturally. And this is the yard that I look at every day across the street from me. This is my neighbor's yard. She has a very strong sense of tidy and everything in its place. I almost called her and texted her and said there's leaves on the driveway, but just to be funny, which I don't think she would have found that amusing. That being said, I really had to think about who was in my garden and who was going to stay. And, you know, one of the key factors for me is thinking about the drought tolerance of the garden. And this last year really pushed the garden in a drought condition, even more so because we also had that heat that came along with it. And I made a list here of plants who came through that heat factor and that drought period. Even though I did water supplementally through those periods, these plants that I have here listed out were the workhorses, if you will, of the garden. In particular, the nine bark. Nine bark I have found is one of the best pollinator plants for our garden, especially for native pollinators. Native pollinators play such a key role and they're very much under recognized. We put so much emphasis on the honeybee because we see it as being such a consumer-driven, if you will, pollinator, right? We do recognize that it's a key player in our food production, but it also produces honey, which is a consumer item. Our native pollinators don't do that, but what they do is they work very hard and get no recognition for it because they are very much responsible for a lot of our food production as well. But nine bark, just for your own notes, comes in a broad range of cultivars now with beautiful folages, prominent bloomers throughout the summer, and then of course in the fall put on a great show. I have to say that probably the strongest performer in the garden this year, though, was the Arbutus unido, this particularly the one that's called compacta. That plant is completely unscathed. It looks as fresh as it could be right now, and it's a fall bloomer, which is a huge thing in our gardens because hummingbirds are very much drawn to that plant this time of year. If your plant is fairly established, if you're familiar with this plant, it's also got fruit on it right now, running from green, yellow, orange, and red. So it's really a showy plant, as well as a very hardworking plant, and it's evergreen. It does a great job. The other plants here, like the Rhamnus californica, not Rhamnus californica, excuse me, alternifolius. I have a Rhamnus. I'll show you a picture of that here in a moment. I have some cupressus, so some dwarf Italian cypress, evergreen huckleberry, sword fern, penstemon, sedum autumn joy, and mahonias, nervosa, and rupins are in my front garden. And these are all what I consider to be strong performing plants, anchor plants for my garden. So with that, I've removed all of the herbaceous perennials that were there, with the exception of a few of those items that we listed. There's particularly the penstemons, which did a great job. You know, herbaceous perennials are workhorses. There's no question about the value and the role that they play in a garden. They bloom profusely, as seen in those photos. The bloom period throughout my garden would start running from about April, and it would go clear into the month of October. I would have flowers in my front garden. They multiply, they attract a host of pollinators. My garden was never without bees, but they also require an inordinate amount of attention. They need staking, they need ties, they need water, they need to be deadheaded on a regular basis. And then they also need to be cut back every year. And oftentimes, because they are so willing to grow so quickly, they need to be divided because they're taking over the space. So they have to be dug and divided. There's so much work that goes into maintaining a perennial border. And I really needed to take that off of my to-do list. And so this year, I've really started to look at what it is I'm going to do. And so I started looking at my garden in terms of what are the high traffic areas, what are the spaces that I look at every day, and then also what are the viewpoints from my home as I look out my windows. And I chose to keep those high value plants. And then I started thinking about things that I wanted to bring into my space that would actually do a better job or perhaps perform on a less heavy maintenance level. So the motivation for me was lower my maintenance. I needed more drought tolerance in my front garden. I'm also mindful of the adapting of our gardens to our climate change conditions, which is heavier rains all at once and then longer periods of dry. So all of the above really ticked all of the boxes for me in terms of my case study here at home. So what I did was I pared it down. I started dividing up spaces. This is just a small example of something that I decided to do. I took the bed and I split it in half. And I put in more accessibility for myself to be able to have access and egress into the garden. Also to have access to the irrigation line instead of stepping through the perennial bed to get to the faucet. And then what it did was it actually framed the image from the window. So this is looking from inside the house. So it's really creating kind of a visual interest for me when I'm standing at my front window and looking out. But it's also kind of creating pared down spaces where I'm not using up as much plant area, and I'm going to have to be more selective with maybe who gets to reside in this space. And I'm not going to try and fill this all at once. And I've just started making some kind of forays into a few things here. There's a bright coral colored flower here. If you can see that, that's epilobium. There are a few other things that I've added, some sedums from around the garden just to kind of get some placeholders in there. But there is room here to kind of play with some more drought tolerant plants. But this epilobium, I just wanted to share that with you. If you're not familiar with this plant, it is a native of Northern California, Southern Oregon. It's also formerly called Zauschneria. It's California fuchsia is another common name for this. This is a must-have plant, and it is very hard to find here in the Pacific Northwest up north here. But I have been able to get it, and I got my original plant from Zera Plants down in Portland, which is a wonderful source for California and Southern Oregon native perennials. If you don't have this plant, you need to get it. It is a great hummingbird plant. It is herbaceous in that it dies down completely, but it comes back with a bang every year. It's only about 6 inches tall, but it spreads to about 2 feet. It makes these wonderful mounds, and it's still blooming. It's starting to wane now that it's October, but it starts blooming in probably August and blooms really solidly through the month of September. And the hummingbirds are just mad for it. And this is something that I've dug and divided and moved over to this new planting area outside of the window. And I'm just looking forward to these big mats of Zauschneria or epilobium taking over that space. Another way for us as gardeners, I think, to kind of refine how we garden is to become more specialized in what we're doing. Instead of trying to tackle broad swaths of landscape, maybe we look at ways to create jewel boxes. And rockeries, I think, are a great way of doing that. And those of you who have visited the garden, this is the rockery on the main path coming into the patio space. This is what it looked like when I excavated and reconstructed it. And here's what it looked like a few months later. It's certainly grown in a lot more. The beauty of a rockery, though, is that they're pretty low maintenance. It's something that you can actually get to and you can fuss with a little bit. I find it's very cathartic sometimes to get away from my desk and go out there and just pick away all of the organic matter that keeps falling, whether it's leaves or flower petals from the stewardia overhead. But I get out there and I have all of these unique little plants here that are, you know, representative of one, there's rhododendron there. There's, you know, a host of saxifrage. There's hepaticas, dianthus, but these are all dwarf or rockery forms, alpine forms of these species. And it's kind of a unique way to kind of shift gears, if you will, for us as gardeners, I think. We don't have to devote large spaces. We can do this within a small footprint. And it can take up maybe a herbaceous planting area that used to be there, but now becomes a little less maintenance, but also still very high visual, high interest. Container gardening, I enjoyed your conversation about the hypertufa class, and I had fun doing that with the group that day at the garden as well. And I'm a big fan of hypertufa. These are hypertufa planters that I've done at the garden. And while I believe in container gardening very strongly, I have big containers on my deck with the thriller spiller, you know, filler kind of thing. This takes container gardening just to a whole new level, and it really allows you to flex your horticultural muscle. And I think for a lot of us, that's half the intrigue here. I hear you talking about sedums and things like that, but there's so many alpine plants out there and dwarf plants that you can use in this particular instance to create a lot of visual interest for you at home and give you some variety in your gardening without having to get down on your hands and knees to do anything. These are, you can see here, been elevated or put on plinths, and the variety in ways in which you can, you know, stage these can just be at your, you know, creative will. It is a lot of fun, and it provides a lot of variety, but it's a great way for those of you who maybe are giving up your gardens, or maybe letting go of space, or downsizing your home and moving to a place where you might not have as much, like a courtyard or something. Incorporating containers like this can bring some variety to your life without letting go of that creativity. Keeping it pretty. You know, that's always at the heart of everything that we do. And, you know, utilizing plants in our garden in such a way to curb some of the overhead, but also to make sure that we still have that visual appeal. I find that I get a lot of inspiration from the Kruckeberg Botanic Garden. You know, I came there about 4 years ago, and I think it was the first time that I really understood that layering effect of native plants. Maureen was, I think, so intelligent about utilizing native plants in conjunction with ornamentals. And I've tried to think of ways in which to exercise that in my own garden here at home. When we talked about the case study and about renovating, portions of my garden have native plants in them. And I've started to really reconsider how to use them in an effective way. You know, when you're at the Kruckeberg, everything is so big and so broad. That's a huge space. That is not a case study for downsizing. But what is there is examples of how foliage can become a tapestry, and how native plants are so inclined to just knit themselves together and to cover the soil. You know, one of the big challenges with gardening is if we don't cover our soils, then they become inundated with weeds or debris, and they can become unsightly. By covering the soil and by taking up square footage year round, we reduce our maintenance. We also reduce moisture loss, and we ultimately encourage and, you know, strengthen the vitality of our soil. And I just find that native plants just do it so naturally, and they create such beautiful visuals. This is the maidenhair fern along with Felictrum or meadow rue growing very nicely together. This is another favorite combination of plants, one that is very enviable by most people. I hear oftentimes when I do tours of the garden that they can't get this particular Cornus canadensis to grow in their garden. And then adjacent to that, in the darker green leaf, is the Mitella ovalis. It's in the saxifrage family. It's also a relative of the, it's gonna leave me now. I'll come back to that. Anyway, really effective ground covers that really do well together. The key to growing Cornus canadensis, and this is the best tip I'll give anybody, incorporate lots and lots of organic matter. They need lots of forest stuff. They need rotting, decomposing wood. This is a plant that grows through rotting and decaying material in the surface of the soil, in the undergrowth of the forest, not in hard actual soil. And so it's actually happier where there's a lot of organic matter. And if you can provide it with that and a little bit of summer water, you'll be rewarded with huge patches of this, with this beautifully blooming in the spring, but also bright red fruit. Bunchberry is its common name because of the bright red fruit that are produced in the fall. Fringe cup, there we go. Mytello ovalis is a relative of fringe cup. In that if you could look very closely at the flower under a lens, you would see that the flower is exactly like a fringe cup. Wonderful little evergreen plant, though, forms mats of greenery, works really well along a walkway or a footpath, where it can be observed and pushed up against other plants. But great textural plant. So back to the case study here, using natives as an anchor within our garden. What I've done here in my front garden on one side is I've decided to go ahead and devote way more space to native plants. Here in this image, you'll see sword fern, which is ubiquitous in the Northwest. But I got to tell you, it's been one of the best performers in my front garden, which is hot and dry most of the summer. It is under a big shade tree right here, so it does get protection from the sun, but it's still very warm and very dry. I've incorporated some of the dreaded oxalis. Some people cringe when they see that plant and they think, ooh, what a thug, and it's going to take over my garden. And yeah, it can. It's in a place here in my garden where it does get droughted a little bit, so it keeps it in check. But it's also kind of bordered in by the large shade tree and by the driveway, so it really can't escape out of that space. And then there's some Vancouveria here as well, the small duckfoot leaf. But if you see those strappy leaves coming up out of the oxalis there, those are the fall blooming colchicum. So even though there are native plants here, I've taken the opportunity to really integrate some non-native plants that are going to provide me with some seasonal interest. So in September and early October, the colchicums are pushing their way up through all of that greenery with their blooms. And then the leaves will come back in the spring and recharge those bulbs. I talk about ratios with native plants as well there. Consider incorporating a ratio of 1/3 ornamental to 2/3 native plants. And the reason why I say that is because one of the things that I've learned now over the last few years is that native plants really require very little attention from me. They pretty much handle everything on their own. They take kind of everything on the chin as it comes. There's a periodic cleaning up that I do, but those are seasonally. I might get in there and do a little cleanup around the sword ferns, although one lesson I have learned about sword ferns, if you leave those old fronds and let things accumulate underneath them, the juncos and the towhees will reward you with little nests of baby birds. That's one of their favorite locations to actually nest. It's quite dry, it's very sheltered, and they can get underneath there. It's also very good for your soil, and it helps protect the soil. But every now and then, I just kind of need to tidy it up. So I do get in there from time to time and remove the oldest of the ferns. But providing yourself with these 2/3, 1/3 ratios, it allows you then to kind of come in behind and incorporate other plants to accentuate or to accentuate their form and their place in your garden. So here's some just a workhorse plant here. This is Mahonia nervosa. Again, it's ubiquitous here in the Northwest, but you can't fault it. Beautiful color, beautiful foliage in the winter, profuse amount of yellow flowers in the spring, and then an abundance of fruit for the wildlife in your garden. Here I was talking about adding, ornamental. So, Brunnera here, Jack Frost, in the front of the rock there. One of my favorite little treasures is the hepatica. It doesn't have a common name that I'm aware of, but it's a wonderful early ephemeral blooming plant, mostly native to Europe and some to Japan and China. Kind of an alpine little plant, very drought tolerant and evergreen, but it has its space there. Please don't look at the weed there in the bottom right-hand corner, though. I think that's nipplewort. But the point being here is that, I'm reducing the amount of space that needs my attention, but still having all of this workhorse planting going on that's just kind of resilient and doing its own thing without requiring a lot of intervention. Eating up square footage is a really important way to cover the soil and also to minimize your upkeep. I've chosen a couple of plants here in my garden to take care of the entryway coming into our home. The evergreen on the left-hand side is epimedium. I mean, everybody in the horticultural community is very familiar with epimediums. There are so many now and so many different flower forms and hybridizations that are going on. This is just epimedium's versicolor variety sulphureum. And what I like about this is that it's taking up such a large curb space. There's not a lot of fuss and muss here. I never touch it. Some people say cut your epimediums back, and I think there are some varieties that really benefit from that, but I've never cut this one back, and it just stays green year round. And then in the spring, it'll just be a cloud of yellow on top with flowers. And to the right of that is the geranium mycorrhiza. Another thuggish perennial, but here it's being kept in check by the driveway and the front steps. And it's being shouldered by the epimedium on the side. So it really does contain it, and it keeps a nice dense coverage of ground. There are no weeds growing in this area. And these two plants require very little irrigation. I do provide them with some summer irrigation, especially with years like we've had this year. But in general, they are flawless on their own. This is just an example and a way to carve up your yard maybe and think about ways to dominate the space. And unlike what I had earlier where I had such a dense amount of variety of plants, I'm simplifying what's going on here and minimizing what I'm trying to accomplish. I think it's really important for us to pay attention to seasonality in our gardens. There's always going to be that period of time in which things don't always look their best, or maybe we accept it for what it is. That's something that we've learned to do at the Kruckeberg, and we do that to help further the ecological sustainability of the garden. Leaving the leaves in place, allowing for there to become a layer of decay underneath the trees and shrubs to improve the overall soil condition, but also to improve soil activity in terms of fungi and insects. The entry garden is a really good example of that. We have here the Stewartia monadelpha and then the large magnolia cobus behind it. And each year, those trees shed their leaves, and in the fall, we get a large crop of Cyclamen hederifolium. But during the spring and summer, that area is completely carpeted by this plant, which is the Myanthemum stellata. This is a wonderful ground cover. It's native. It does an incredible job, and it enhances the visual as you're coming into the garden with this very simple kind of plane, if you will, with the large trunks of the trees. And here it's being accentuated by the male fern as well. This is a great opportunity to utilize this plant in your own garden in such a way that you could have large sword ferns, you could have trilliums coming up through them, you could have spring bulbs coming up through them. In the wintertime, the hederifolium cyclamen is evergreen. So when this plant has gone completely dormant, then we see these large patches of cyclamen hederifolium in this area, along with all of the dead leaves. So a really good workhorse plant here. I can't fault it. It's really striking, and it does such a great job. If you look closely, there is some of the other Myanthemum here, the Myanthemum dilatatum, which is false lily of the valley. So more of a heart-shaped leaf. But the stellatum is the one that we're really trying to focus on here in this area. After you've thought about incorporating all of these kind of anchor plants and putting in these ground covers and things to help minimize your upkeep, also think about ways in which to incorporate summer dry bulbs. Summer dry bulbs are such a great way to bring color and vitality into your garden seasonally. Here, for example, is the camas. Camas is a wonderful plant. Again, a native bulb here for us, mostly in the plateaus and the plains area south of us. but they do grow very well here. This was a picture of one in my own garden. And what I do is I just incorporate them down into other plants, and they push their way up through it. And they bloom for quite a short period in terms of flowering plants, but they do a wonderful job of attracting pollinators and then self-sowing and producing more of themselves. And you don't have to do anything. The greenery of that plant continues to stay green for a period of time and then goes dormant and basically disappears. You don't have to go through and clean it out. And it's, again, a summer dry plant, so it doesn't require water to maintain it through the summer. Once it's done, it's done. It's stored its energy for the year and will sit there dormant for the rest of the summer. Another great early spring summer dormant plant is Erythronium revolutum. This is absolutely one of my favorite plants in the garden at the Kruckeberg. And like I say here, it will charm your socks off. It will form little communities, little colonies over time. It is a deeply rooted little bulb and is commonly called the dogtooth lily because of its shape with sort of a toothy kind of root structure where it kind of hangs down. Its nature is to move up in the early spring and start to grow and bloom and then to travel back down. It makes it very difficult for us to go down and harvest it out of the garden to make propagule to sell for the garden, for the nursery. So we have to do it fairly early on or shortly after the bloom has faded. We need to go down and dig them before they start to move back down into the soil. But a wonderful early spring bloomer. I really find that the best way to have this plant is to incorporate it under established trees and shrubs. It will come up early. The leaves will start to emerge, usually about the middle end of February, depending on the kind of spring that we're having, and then be blooming by the middle end of March. And then by the end of April and the first part of May, the plants themselves will be completely gone and disappeared. All that will be left will be the little seed capsules that will be held aloft. So they're really well suited for established garden spaces where they can just kind of naturalize, and you're not going to be doing a lot of cultivating. So don't dig in those areas regularly and try not to disrupt them. And you'll be rewarded with a wonderful display every spring. This again would be a great example of a plant to incorporate with a ground cover like the Myanthemum. This plant would come up and do its thing, and the Myanthemum would come back and cover it all up and take over the space. And of course, we can't be short shifting the wonderful Trillium. The Kruckeberg has a wonderful collection of Trillium growing throughout it. And they've been there for decades now. This is a plant that can live for almost 100 years. They do wonderfully here because this is their native habitat, but there are so many species of Trillium to choose from. And they too will just go dormant through the summer months, which makes them such a suitable plant for us here in the Pacific Northwest in our dry summers. Again, use this plant under established plants where you're not going to do a lot of cultivating, and then rely heavily on ants to distribute the seed every year and to reward you with hopefully new plants in your garden. I don't know if a lot of people realize it, but ants are the vector for which the Trillium gets its seed spread. It has a very thick gelatinous coating on its seeds. It's called an elaiosome. And every time the Trilliums ripen here at the garden, the ants are just somehow, they just seem to know. And it's really fascinating to watch the ants traveling back and forth, harvesting this protein fat-rich coating on these seeds and hauling some of the seeds away. And then they deposit the seeds in their compost within their their ant colonies have little compost, a little den, and they just deposit that seed, and it's a nice nutrient-rich bed for which it can germinate. We talked about the cyclamen earlier on. Just want to put a little more focus on that too here. This is such a wonderful fall blooming plant. As things in the garden are starting to wane and not have much interest to them, this plant just comes bouncing forward and ready to just, and it really does shine at the Kruckeberg. They've been in the garden here now for decades, and the ants, of course, are another vector for distributing the seeds of cyclamen. So we literally now have cyclamen all the way up onto 15th Avenue Northwest, up by the guardrail after all these years. But never disappointed by the cyclamen. They form a large corm type structure, which is really what makes them so drought tolerant. They go dormant through the summertime and all of that energy is stored there. Once the fall rains start to happen, then the flowers will come forth. And then as the flowers are fading, the foliage, as you can see here, starts to emerge. And this plant has a broad range of color and as well as foliage. Now here in this image, you see two types of cyclamen. We have the cyclamen coum, which is the lily pad structure, and then the shield, variegated shield leaf is the hederifolium. And the myriad number of versions of this leaf in terms of variegation, in terms of green or silver or white, it's just innumerable because it hybridizes so readily. And when you visit the Kruckeberg and you're walking around, especially now as the leaves are out, you'll see anywhere of upwards of 20 different leaf patterns within the garden. It really does make for an interesting plant, and it is a low maintenance, does not require any intervention on your part whatsoever. It's very successful. I think it's a little too successful. Just a note that British Columbia has put Cyclamen hederifolium on the noxious weed list, which is surprising, but it is our opinion that this plant does not encumber other plants. It doesn't have an adverse reaction or impact on our garden. And so we're questioning what the validity is for putting it on the noxious weed list. We don't understand that. And one of my favorite plants to incorporate into the garden is the Douglas or Pacific Coast hybrids. Oregon and Oregon and California have, I think, 11 species of native irises. This is Pacific Coast hybrid. That's because those irises have hybridized between themselves. And now more in cultivation, Pacific Coast hybrids have been taken to the next level, and there are even more color variations and flower forms. But in general, this is a very consistent plant for us at the Kruckeberg. It's evergreen. It handles seasonal drought beautifully. It's called the grass iris because of the very narrow strappiness of the leaves. They're oftentimes when there's no flowers, you would walk right by it and not realize that it was an iris because it's not what we are horticulturally tuned to. But when they're in bloom, there is no question. The variety of color, the delicateness of the blooms, the way they accentuate the garden, and when you find them in masses like we have at the Kruckeberg, where they're blooming in large clumps, it is a showstopper. But the beauty of it is that this is such a low maintenance plant. It requires very little or no intervention on our part, except for when we want propagule. And so we'll get in there now at this time of year and do some divisions and pot them up for our guests to buy at the nursery. But it is a wonderful plant. I highly recommend incorporating it into your garden. Use it along the borders in the shade, part shade, full sun. It can handle well-drained soils. It does not like to be wet. It does want to have a fair amount of organic matter incorporated into the soil. So make sure you use a fair amount of compost when you plant them, but make sure that they have good drainage and can dry out a little bit through the summer months. They will hybridize in your own garden, and they will produce seed, and you'll have baby irises coming up in your garden as well. So, but not in any way form of a nuisance plant, if you will. Just another example, this is Iris tenax, which is the Oregon iris, which is one of the hybrid parents. So that's my talk for you today. Do you have any questions or?
I have a question.